Lineage Series, Book 1, Chapter 2. Late afternoon sun turned the flat pond into a sheet of fiery glass. Flagstones worn to small critters by 1,000 generations of passing feet curved around the pond and cut through the edge of the copse to arrive at the meeting hut. In a field of volcanic rocks, 4 thick posts made the corners of the square meeting hut, supporting the walls of plaster on a backbone of woven sticks. Dark brown reeds thatched the low pyramidal roof, and 4 windows, one on either side of the door and one on each connecting side, let light into the building. The interior was as sparsely appointed as the outside, with an oil lamp suspended near the middle of the back wall providing the only internal source of light. A thick woven green carpet covered the floor, and on its center stood a knee-high table laden with bread, fruit, and drink for a light afternoon meal. A man clothed in the finest fabrics, dyed the richest black, reclined on the cushions at the table. Across from him, a man in undyed wool sat rigidly on his heels. "Should it take this long?" the reclining man asked. The lightness of the almost blonde hair that framed his face and blue eyes were typical of his Kospal heritage. Messengers reported the scrolls missing over a week ago. "She will wait until she is certain no one follows, my lord," the older, rigid man placated. Lord Falson turned away, resigning himself to waiting. He hated waiting. He plucked a grape and rolled it between his thumb and forefinger, lost in thought and muttering to himself. "This should have been mine by now. She should be flogged for taking so long." "She's the best, my lord," the elder assured. "So you've said," came the snorted reply. "She will pay if you have lied to me." For a moment the elder bit his lip in frightened anxiety, as the need to defend her struggled to summon courage. At last he made an oblique counter. "Your lordship is known to be a great scholar in the scroll's lore, but translation has eluded even your expertise." "Yes," Falson replied evenly, although his hard eyes had already narrowed on the elder. "You could never touch the pramonk," the elder said, and a wicked sort of smile played at the edge of Falson's mouth. "His young disciple is the only other monk who knows the Shangon tongue." The old Darkin flinched as the lord quickly seized his glass from the table. "And," Falson began in a slow, menacing tone, "I hear the boy is nearly equal able to defend himself. I fail to see how any of this is helpful, Yarian." "But there is one other person, my lord." "Who?" Falson demanded, slamming his glass on the table in annoyance that he had not heard this before. 3 quiet taps at the door interrupted. Silence passed as Yarian feared who outside may have overheard what. Falson felt no fear or embarrassment, as is the prerogative of the rich and powerful. Yarian chose to answer the door, not the question. "Come in." The door slid open, and Milan stepped inside. "Ah, Milan," Yarian, the master of the Darkons, announced in warm relief. Lord Falson turned to her with a scrutinizing stare. "Drana Yarian," Milana replied and bowed. "Milan, this is Lord Lucius Falson," Master Yarian introduced. Milan looked at Falson, who did not bother to rise on introduction, as was his noble privilege. A short, well-trimmed mustache and small beard perfectly framed his severe mouth. "So this is the Lord Lucius Falson," she thought. From all the stories she had heard, she knew he was not to be trusted. Yet she knew the proper ways to act before nobility. Milan bowed to the Lord Falson. "Your lordship." Falson nodded in response. Master Yarian spoke again. "I hope you have good news for us since—" "Did you get them?" Falson demanded impatiently. What would you do if you got your hands on them? She thought. Milan barely hesitated. Another intruder was there that night. The fool set fire to one of the Senya's huts. I was caught fighting off the guards, but I was not fast enough to stop the man. Oh, Master Yarian said, and sadly dropped his head in disappointment. His eyes shifted toward Falson, both eager for and fearing a response. Lucius Falson gave none. He had been told she was the best, and yet she claimed failure. Curious why she should be held in high esteem, Falson studied the dirty creature before him. She hardly looked the part of an important person. She slouched, her clothes were shabby, and after traveling, a layer of dirt further darkened her already tanned skin. Milan's dark hair was pulled back in a tight bun that showed her face. Falcone saw her dark brown eyes bordered in green, and knew that to some degree she had true Darkon heritage. The rest of her features, however, were mottled, revealing she was no pureblood, but a mutt. Sometimes, Falcone mused, mixed breeds produced interesting specimens. He turned to Urian with a slight nod. Given permission, Urian said, "You may go," and dismissed Milan. "Yes, Thrana." Milan bowed and left. Falcone waited until her steps faded, until she must be gone. Then a moment more, his mind picking slowly and carefully through the details with the leisurely pace of a privileged man. Then he spoke. "She's lying to us." The level anger in his voice mixed with an odd degree of admiration. Urian's eyes darted to the door after Milan, but he dared not turn away from Falcone for more than an instant. Full of trepidation for her, Urian asked, "How do you know?" "The other intruder was my servant. It was she whom he saw take the scrolls." "I thought Darkons were honorable, Urian. Yet your best has lied to me." "My lord," Urian began. "I have given swift punishment for lesser offenses," Falcone reminded. "She will be made to tell." "That is unwise," tumbled from Urian as he rose higher on his knees. Falcone's heavy silence made worse threats than any words. But in this, Urian could not remain completely silent, even if he could not find the words to fully speak his mind. He defended Milan with the only thing that could stop Falcone's wrath: proof of her worth. "Milan is the one who can translate Shinran." Falcone's eyes turned sharply to the door, as if he could see Milan through it. "Ah, so she protects them. She is the key to power." Another long moment he sat in dark thoughts. Here was a matter better handled by less direct methods than torture. Why was she not brought to me before? "I did not know you desired it, my lord," Urian answered in a trembling voice. "I very much do." Falcone drew a hand across his bearded chin as he contemplated this new plan. "In exchange for her, you will be Lord Governor when I take control." Urian writhed for a moment, suppressing a disgust that almost surpassed his fear. He was not in the habit of bartering with the lies of others, and he did not lightly tolerate those who were. "I must warn you, my lord, I do not believe Milan's heart still follows our code. She is young. It's likely for youths to stray while trying to find their own identity. Bring her to me. Tonight. Now, you will tell me all about Milan." Urian froze where he kneeled. His throat went arid. He was dealing with secrets too important to reveal, but Falcone could ferret out lies if Urian gave anything less than the truth. "Have a seat," Falcone gestured to the cushions. It was not an offer. With a tortured conscience, Urian obeyed. After curving around the reflecting pond, the flagstone path made a sharp turn and swung away through a stand of trees. As she left the meeting hut, Milan saw a young Darkin, Jataran, just off the path of the copse. His hanging head and slow gait told her he was not his usual cordial self. When he felt this way, he liked to be alone, and Jataran always felt this way when Falcone was around. Milan would have gone to speak to him anyway, to make sure he was all right, but in Jataran's slight turn of his head at her approach, she saw what only a close friend would understand. He had been waiting. Jataran was a dark-haired young man, approaching 18, who surveyed the world through deep black eyes. His tall frame was as lean and strong as the young trees around him, though his stiff movement did not match their limber swaying in the breeze. The single flaw on his face was the scar above his right eyebrow that stretched to his temple. As he walked, he absently pulled a twig off a tree and twisted it until the bark began to split and peel away. When the twig became a frayed mess, he threw it off into the trees, just as Milan joined his side. "Go to Freer," Jodo whispered in the Darkhan tongue. Milan understood the urgency without his saying, but with Sadie possibly behind every stone, she was careful to act as casual as Jatarn had in his watch. For several moments the two Dargons walked together, until Milan could not help breaking the silence. "You good, Jodo?" Everyone called him Jodo. He raised his head as he looked at her. With a counterfeit smile, Jodo replied, "As good as one could expect." Then his smile faded and he looked down. A few more silent moments passed, because there was a question Milan feared to ask. She did not want to upset Jodo further, but she was concerned. "And the doctors. How is your mother?" Milan whispered. Jodo flinched at the question, but he was not angry with her. She was one of the few who understood his behavior now, and she asked only because she cared. It was a long while before he was even able to answer. "Just walk," Jodo muttered to her. Milan let the subject drop. In silence, she walked beside him through the woods. As society's orphans, Darkon culture became its own family. Adranatha, not quite parent or teacher, fell somewhere in the vague territory of confidant and counselor. Milan had turned to Freyr in many troubled times before, but his words now were harder than ever to accept. Milan stood at attention in the center of the one-room hut, head bowed in both sadness and anger, as the lantern above singled her out with light as harsh as Freyr's words. Hadranatha stood with his back to her in defense against the retaliation he knew would come. "How can you suggest that, Dranafrir?" Milan asked painfully. She intentionally dropped the familiar subtitle to underline her disappointment. "My family denies me, and now you? You throw me out as well?" "Milan, it is time for all those who can to flee." "You seemed to think quite differently years ago," Milan objected quietly. She did not easily forget the departing of Darkons, nor the painful farewells said because she stayed. In a moment of silence, Freyr bowed his head with a sigh of regret. Then Milan continued, "I would have left then, but I listened to you." Freyr looked at her with a saddened but determined glance. "Years ago I spoke to keep our future, our greatest in generations, from departing before our eyes. I see now they had greater foresight than I. I should have realized that in desperate times we would fall fast, because no one would help us. Now we are at desperate times. Escape while you can." "Why don't you leave?" Milan shrewdly demanded. "I can't," Freyr admitted. Though he drew himself up nobly, Milan saw regret behind his eyes. "My voice still carries some weight in the outside world, and Falson will only tighten his hold on the Darkons faster if I disappear. I must stay to save those I can. But you, Milan, not a Drana, not a leader, you can get away now." "If we all flee, who's left to fight?" Milan countered. "For your own sake," he began. "My sake," Milan repeated. Freyr knew he had made a mistake, and that appealing to self-interest was not the way to persuade her. "Milan," Freyr began, but Milan knew he was only going to delay. "Why?" she demanded. "Yarian cannot hide the truth from Falson for long," Freyr admitted. His eyes darted to the door in fear, as if speaking the name might somehow summon the man like an evil spirit. In a hushed tone, he continued, "Falson will know all by the end of the day, if not already. You do not know what has happened in the weeks while you were gone. I tried to send messages to prevent you ever returning. I have sent letters to my brother explaining our situation. What I need, what we all need, is for you to stay out of his grasp while I try to get help." Milan slowly nodded. If Falson knew all, she would be no help to anyone here. "Can you have Epon waiting in the thicket?" Milan asked. "Yes. We will draw Falson's eye for the rest of the evening so he will not seek you. Can you get Balmor out as well?" Milan looked over her shoulder at the windows and doors before whispering, "We'd have to go over the crater wall. Can he manage?" "He'll have to," Freyr insisted in a tone that would not contemplate failure. He turned, opened the chest behind him, and pulled out a small cloth bundle. "I had a change of clothes brought for you. Best not to go back to your hut. Stay concealed until dark and meet Balmor at the grove. He will go to the Senye." Of the sacred places in the Darkon home, none was more dear than the shrine of Anut. Although the reason for the shrine's sanctity had drifted from history to legend and into forgotten myth over 1,000 years, it remained a place of refuge from the world. Several of the greatest masters of Halang had traced their descent from Anut, a Dakana ancestor of the Darkons, who lived many unknown generations ago in the wild forests of the ancient world, in a time when the free world of Koyant did not exist. An old worn path, once paved in cut stone, but now mostly formed of packed dirt, blended into the forest floor leading to the shrine entrance, deep in the woods. A rectangular hollow, cloven from the rock face, opened to the stone steps, leading down into the dark earth. But below, a light shone in the distance. An archway at the foot of the stair formed the entry to the simple shrine. Darkons had never liked ornate things, preferring the simplicity of nature, so their most beloved of sights was decorated with roughly made torches scattered around the room in a general circle. At the center was the altar itself, merely a round rock, rising only a foot from the ground. White pebbles embedded in the dirt floor radiated from the centerpiece, in a design now shabby from the loss of stones over the ages. Many shrines had fallen into disrepair with the collapse of Kliwa, the Darkon's religion, nearly 500 years earlier. Regardless of the decay of tradition, the Anut shrine remained sacred to Darkons. The torches were always lit in her honor. Even though symbolic design on the floor was worn away, the proper torches were gone. Moisture had destroyed the carved text on the walls, and the statuette of Nanut had long ago disappeared. Darkons had always come to Anut's shrine in times of need, believe it or not, and the same ancient need drew Milan the evening of her departure. She had found consolation there many nights after her mother's death, but now even that comfort did not seem enough. Milan was not one to turn her back on a friend, especially when in need, let alone the only family she had ever known. Now she had no choice. The shrine torches did not flicker in the still air, nor did her entrance disturb the sleeping bats preparing for midnight flight. Milan bowed toward the empty altar stone. Torchlight glistened off the surface worn smooth by generations who had found it as comforting as a dear friend, but it was both balm and wound. The polish, built up by uncounted shattered hearts, was a reminder of 1,000 losses, the one connection they still had to their Darkon ancestors. With both despair and longing, Milan sat on the stone, resting her head on a knee drawn up to her chest. In silent understanding, Milan knew this was the last time she would see Anut's shrine, or feel the ease from pain this place of meditation brought. Her heart sank so low it was no longer a part of her being. Whether she left or not, the Darkons were coming to an end. They had been for 1,000 years. All would become but a small memory etched in time, no different from those who had come and been forgotten before. With a swelling of inexpressible sorrow, Milan's heart seemed to rise again until it stuck in her throat, choking her until a few stifling tears fell on the cold, worn stone. Footfalls near the entrance drew Milan out of her melancholy. Such a likely refuge was bound to be searched. She did not wait to see if the intruder were friend or foe, for Milan could not afford to be noticed by either. Fortunately, few knew of the oblique fissure in the back wall of the cave that eventually widened into another exit for those thin and flexible enough to pass through. Milan had put the change of clothes Freya provided in her sack, but had kept the mask and hood. She pulled it over her head now as she squeezed into the fissure. Once far enough into the crack to be unseen, she paused in silence and listened to the pair of footsteps coming down the stair. The weight of the steps and the occasional clank of metal suggested fully armed patrol of Sadie. Lacking a Darkon's eye in the dark, the first Sadie violently waved his roaring torch at the shadowed edges of the chamber. The second man gave up on his sputtering torch and jabbed it into the wall to put it out, with no regard for the text carved there. Milan's fists tightened, but she remained still. If they did not return from their patrol, more would be sent. As their footsteps faded up the stairs, Milan slid further into the fissure and disappeared back into the night air. As Milan crept by the small huts where others were asleep, or at least should have been, she could see the fires at the center green. The bonfires, a new addition since her trip, were brought by the Sadie to ensnare the minds of the younger generation. At least their proximity to the fire would ruin the Sadie's night vision and make her all the more invisible. Milan moved on, and the bonfires were no longer the only source of light. She would normally be careful to avoid a lighted room, but she noticed it was Jodo's lamp, and curiosity got the better of her. As she moved closer, the shelves that housed Jodo's library came into view first. He was much a scholar as a warrior, always reading books on history, philosophy, strategy, or anything he could obtain. Like a true Darkon, Jodo hoarded stories and knowledge, as others hoarded gold. The manuscripts, some in ancient states of decay, stood neatly divided and arranged in the manner of a compulsive organizer. Milan inched nearer, around a boulder, and as her line of sight changed, Milan identified Jodo in the pallid light standing in the center of the room. Falcone was there as well. Milan's right hand balled up until her knuckles turned white. She had never met Falcone before that afternoon, yet she knew full well that Jodo was Falcone's son. A disappointment to Falcone, fully. He was ashamed to have a runaway son who would join a group of social outcasts over being a noble lord like his father. Still, Falcone claimed Jodo as his own. There must be some use to him. Milan knew that Jodo always moved with an unexplained slow stiffness when his father was around. She soon saw why. Jodo was reduced to a punching bag for his father's rage. Years of practice enabled Jodo to remain silent with strike after strike as he held his ground to take the next hit. Despite his refusal to defend himself, Jodo's fists were clenched and his knuckles white, and each time he stepped up, he lifted his head with the defiance of resiliency. The man never returned the look. He refused to even see the face of the boy he hurt. As the beating continued, Jodo's tears of rage grew to a multitude, but he never once broke his silence. Just as Jodo knew to keep quiet, Lord Falcone never raised his insults beyond a terrifying growl, or his fists above the shoulder. Against nobility, gossip was a formidable weapon that destroyed the reputations legacies were built on. As the highest and most ancient of nobles, the Falcones knew how to hide their troubles, and the violent scene was conducted in traditional silence. The attack finally ended when Falcone threw a series of strikes before Jodo could regain his footing, and one connected with his lip, leaving blood on his father's fist. It was not until this single blow to the face that Jodo was forced to a knee, and sunk down to sit on his heels, hunched over. "You will never be anything," Falcone muttered as he left. As Lucius Falcone disappeared out the front toward the bonfires, Jodo stumbled to his feet and fled out the back, exiting the open door that Milan had watched through. She saw him escape to the woods that concealed the Darkon home. A moment later, Milan followed, coming from behind where he sat on a boulder. Silent sobs shook his whole body. Jodo snapped to attention when Milan intentionally stepped on a twig to make her presence known. "Milan!" Jodo cried in relief, to see it was only her as she pulled down the mask. Anxiety quickly replaced his relief. "You should be gone!" A horrible thought struck Milan. Fear said others would keep Falcone distracted for the rest of the evening. She dared not think that Jodo had willingly taken punches to keep his father preoccupied. It would be a poor return for her to be caught now. Milan swallowed hard and whispered, "In a moment." He was already on his feet, scanning the area for any watching eyes. Jodo gestured farther into the woods. "You have to go." She gently took the wrist of his raised hand to draw his attention back and hold his eyes as she more firmly stated, "In a moment." Milan would not so easily leave him alone after what she had witnessed. Jodo's tensed shoulders dropped, knowing she had seen. He both regretted that she knew his pathetic shame and valued the compassion, not pity, behind her eyes. She released his wrist, and he caught sight of his own hand, covered in blood from his lip. "I wish I could drain every drop. Get rid of it," he said. "Then he would no longer be a part of me." Milan bit off the first words that came to mind. Anger would not help him now. Instead, she spoke words of assurance. "He is unworthy of the blood of your ancestors, not you." "My blood is his," Jodo snapped. "It's poison in my veins." His body seemed to shrink in on itself in a convulsion of disgust. Jodo controlled his shuddering for a moment to whisper, "I'm weak. I don't stop him." "No," Milan firmly stated. "You could destroy him, but you refuse to be him. that takes greater strength. Jodo gained more control of himself and for a moment looked back at Milan. Then he declared with some residual anger, "Someday I will prove I am not useless. I will succeed. I will be someone." Milan's heart sunk for him. Despite everything, he still sought his father's approval and hoped for something that he knew could never be. That doomed hope was the worst abuse of all. "Jodo," Milan advised as she placed a reassuring hand on his arm, "there is no shame. You don't have to prove yourself to anyone." He reflected on her remark for a moment, but did not want to continue this subject, and tried to steer away. "Is that your reason?" Jodo asked. "Me?" Milan thought a moment. "Let them hold to their prophecies. They can believe whatever they want. I just don't want to be it." "Why? What happened to your ambition?" Jodo asked. "All my ambition was doing was convincing them I'm something I'm not. The elders simply made my life a game I got sick of playing. You're the ambitious one. You conquer a country for me, will you?" Milan smiled, and Jodo managed a small laugh. "Jodo, don't let your father control you." Jodo nodded. "Right. That wasn't very convincing," Milan said. He looked at Milan with tear-stained eyes. "I can't say it with conviction." "Ambition without conviction gets you nowhere," Milan said, "whereas I must go somewhere." Jodo was silent a moment. He placed a hand over hers where it still rested on his arm, and drew himself up to confess, "I'll miss you. I hope you can come back." He didn't say soon, because Jodo knew it was a question of if, not when. "You're a good person and deserve better. Remember that," Milan said as she slipped into the shadows.